you so much, Pearl, and thank you to Freedom Cities for having us. So we'll jump right in. As Pearl mentioned, what we'd like to do is share a little bit about how we have used a local to national approach to resist FBI and JTTF surveillance in an effort to limit the ability of our police to collude with the FBI. So just a quick roadmap of where we'd like to go, because we know that there's a wide range of familiarity with the Joint Terrorism Task Force and the FBI. We'd like to start by sort of explaining what the problem is and what our communities have been facing for decades now. And after that, we'll go into the campaign starting in Portland, going to San Francisco, and then do a really more of a deep dive into the strategies and tactics that we used in San Francisco to pass an ordinance restricting the ability of San Francisco's police department to collude with the FBI. And then we wanted to also really briefly highlight how Oakland was different, because the campaign in Oakland looked very different for a number of reasons. And we don't want people to come away with an idea that the San Francisco method has to be used in every city in order for it to work, because that's certainly not the case. And then we'll talk a little bit about what resources CAIR and the Asian Law Caucus can provide to any organization or entity that wants to take up a part of this campaign or all of the campaign, or just get some more information. So we'll begin with why the JTTF is a problem. So for those who are unfamiliar with it, the JTTF is a very strange kind of partnership between the FBI and local police departments. As most folks know, the FBI and local police work together in a lot of different contexts, like, for example, if there's a cross-border kidnapping, something like that. But these kinds of partnerships are very different, because instead of local police working with the FBI, we have local police plucked out of their offices, plucked out of their local police departments, and placed in the federal building where they work as FBI agents. They work as federal agents, to the point that they're even deputized as federal agents. And the problem there is that this part gets a little bit complicated, but essentially what happens is that they start following federal rules. And the federal rules are very different than local and state rules. And the other large part of the problem is that once those officers are taken out and put in the FBI's office, the FBI controls them and supervises them. So what we see is the kind of abuses that we see at the FBI level start happening at the local level also. And so we also wanted to flag a little bit about the JTTF. It's not just a local police department plus the FBI. There are many other federal entities that are in there. So DHS, ICE, et cetera, are all involved there. And a lot of people are surprised by the fact that ICE is in there, but ICE itself brags about the fact that it is in the FBI. It is in every Joint Terrorism Task Force throughout the country. And the proof of that is if you go to ice.gov/JTTF, they're bragging about it on that website. So this is a very real problem for not just the Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian community, but also for any community that's resisting federal abuses. So we talked a little bit about the fact that local police start following the FBI's rules when they are in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. So we want to talk a little bit about why those rules are so problematic. So for those who are unfamiliar, there's 3 different kinds of ways the FBI can investigate someone. And the lowest level is called an assessment. And we wanted to highlight this because, as Ahmad will share with you in just a couple of minutes, CAIR and Asian Law Caucus, the vast majority of our FBI clients are targeted in assessments. So even though it is the lowest level, it affects a huge number of Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian community members. And also, that acronym is really long, so I'll just say AMEMSA for short from now on. So it's the lowest level, but that doesn't mean that it's not incredibly invasive and harmful. So just to give you some of an idea of what they can do during an assessment, they can interview people about the target. They can request records from foreign governments and from foreign governments and US government entities and compile a file on the person. They can physically surveil the person, follow the target around day and night, use informants to get information on them, and use the informant to help them surveil the person. And they can also conduct what they call voluntary interviews with the person. Sorry, just a moment. Slight technical difficulty here. Okay, and so continuing on with why this is such a problem. In order to open an assessment, they don't need any facts at all showing that the person has done something wrong. For people who are familiar with the reasonable suspicion standard with the local police, that would be a godsend to us in this context. They don't have to show any facts. They can know for a fact that a person has not and will never do anything wrong, and they can still go after them in these ways. And in addition to the only real restriction on it is that they have to have an authorized purpose for opening up an assessment. But all they have to do is cite national security, and that's enough for them to go after people in this way. Oh, I'm sorry, and Ahmad, did you want to take it away from here?
Sure. Thank you, Tina. Speaking about generally sort of what questions have been asked of individuals who have been assessments, and as like Tina said, the proof that is required for the FBI to conduct these assessments is very, very low. We've used the term, and I think many activists have used the terms of a fishing expedition, where they're just hoping to talk to anyone and everyone. A tactic they generally don't use to say, for example, speak to people who are sort of associated with white supremacy and right-wing terrorism. Some of the examples that we've seen throughout our work of individuals within these MEMSA communities has been people losing their jobs because the FBI will show up at their workplace continuously until they agree to speak to them. The employer is often spooked, and that might lead to them being fired. And then they're really persistent in that way. We've seen individuals who've sort of had family members who've ostracized them because they just didn't want to be associated with them. So someone will actually, a relative of that person who was visited by the FBI saying that we don't want to associate with you because we don't want to come under scrutiny. We know that people have stopped, for example, or curtailed going to the mosque or other community centers with the community, both to protect the community, because some of the questions that the FBI asks, as you'll see in the next slide, is around like who they know who goes to a particular mosque. And so we've seen these sort of impacts. Like Tina said, an assessment is the lowest level. It doesn't need any probable cause or reasonable suspicion, which is what local law enforcement and even generally law enforcement all across the country is required to adhere to. So what kind of questions do they ask us? They ask you questions that you would reasonably think are in violation of the First Amendment, whether that's a freedom of association or a freedom of religion. So things like, where do you pray? Have you ever looked at ISIS material? What do you think of ISIS or other sort of agencies or organizations that are against the United States? They might ask questions about your opinions on the Trump administration. They often ask you questions about another individual in the community about when did you start noticing that this individual became more quote unquote religious or visibly religious? When have they grown a beard? They might look at, for example, books in your home if they do come in. And homes of community members that may be in languages other than English, so a Quran or other religious, literature, which is in a language outside of English. They sometimes ask people to write down the names of everyone they know who attended a particular mosque or who may know a particular individual. Like I said, sometimes we at CAIR and ALC have advised people who've had travel delays. One interesting thing, just like Tina mentioned, that ICE is also sometimes connected to JTTF efforts, is that if the FBI visits you and you refuse to talk to them or you have issues with them, they sometimes use this tactic of like delaying your travel. So you might be questioned by TSA or CBP coming back because all of this information is shared, which is not a surprise to anyone in this atmosphere that all this information is shared within the federal agency. So you will see CBP then taking on the role of FBI agents and asking you the same questions that you did not answer when the FBI approached you. And so that's like travel delays. You'll see yourself in secondary screening. And so we've had individuals and clients who've gone through that. They ask these, you have a right to counsel under the Fourth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment, but they'll ask you questions like, you're not guilty. Why would you need an attorney to speak to us? It's a simple conversation. You yourself are not a target of this investigation. So what do you, need to speak to us? We've seen lately, and as Jeff Sessions has sort of come out with earlier this year, this focus on Black identity extremists. So members in your community who might identify with Black Lives Matter or other movements for equality and justice. We've seen water protectors at Standing Rock being targeted, and there's documents to reveal that. We know the FBI has gone way back so far as with the COINTELPRO program targeting civil rights activists. And we've known within MEMSA communities that they have targeted mosques. And so that's been one of the issues that we've sort of dealt with. Moving on to the next stuff, what we want basically to take, for you to take away from this sort of comparison between what the FBI does and what local law enforcement does is that regardless of how regressive and atrocious your local police department is, they're required to adhere to what the Supreme Court has clearly delineated for many, many years, the reasonable suspicion standard. So you need to have some reasonable suspicion that criminal activity is afoot or some sort of criminal activity is present before you can conduct sort of an investigation, stop an individual, and even in stop and frisk cases. And that's obviously you need probable cause to have an arrest warrant or a search warrant to come in. So there needs to be some sort of facts showing that this person might be committing some sort of crime or might be engaged in the activity. But like I said, there is no fact, like Tina said, there's no factual predicate, which means there are no facts underlying why the FBI goes and speaks to someone. They simply need to give a reason behind it, which is usually national security, a very, very easy catchphrase, umbrella term that's thrown around quite a bit. Then it leads to the question, why does the FBI recruit local officers? What we found, and I think what Tina will speak about in our campaigns in San Francisco, Portland, is that it's often easiest for the FBI to work with people on the ground. So they need individuals who are sort of familiar with institutions on the ground, organizations, mosques, community centers, quote unquote known troublemakers. And so for that reason, they've found it's much more easier for them to speak to and work with local law enforcement. So whether that's SFPD or Oakland PD. Because the officers are deputized, you might often see an Oakland police officer showing up, but doing the work of the FBI. And so sometimes people are like lulled into this false sense of like, oh, I might have to speak to this person because he's a police officer. He's just generally starting to he's just checking in to see if everything's okay. And so our hope is that, if we reduce the involvement of local police departments from doing even these unwarranted assessments, that we can stop a lot of this effort from the FBI and getting into people's business, really. I think the next thing that we want to talk about, and you'll see how this has come into effect with our campaigns in San Francisco and Oakland, but also I think Tina's going to speak about the Portland example.
Thanks, Ahmad. Oops. Okay, sorry, technology is not doing what I tell it to. There we go. So now that we have a sort of at least a baseline understanding, hopefully, of what the JTTF is, what the FBI is, and why we're still concerned about it, we can jump into the actual campaign to try and do something about it. And the first thing, as Ahmad mentioned, that we'd like to do is give props to Portland. We were not involved in the Portland effort, but the story does start in Portland. They didn't, at the time that we started these campaigns, they didn't have an ordinance, which is a local law, stopping the FBI from, stopping the local police from joining into the JTTF, but they were the first city that we know of, at least, that really, in a concerted way, pushed back against this. And we wanted to be mindful of that and give props to Portland for that, but also being mindful that this is not our story to tell. We've provided a link there on the slide that's for at least one resource that has testimony from folks in Portland about how they push back on it. And we have a whole host of resources on this that we're more than happy to share with folks. But again, to be respectful, we don't want to tell other people's stories. So with that, we can move into a story that we do know quite a bit, because both CAIR and Asian Law Caucus were very intimately involved in this effort. So going into San Francisco. So we now know that there's a huge problem with local police working with the FBI. And before we started these campaigns, we started actually with a top-down approach. We thought, okay, the FBI's rules are terrible. The fact that they are allowed to do this to people is absolutely atrocious. We should try to change their rules. And advocates across the country worked for decades to try and change these rules. And advocates weren't the only ones working on it. The church committee report that you see there is pointing out a lot of the problems of unbridled FBI power. But the long story short on that is that advocates tried and failed to reform the FBI's rules. And what we thought of at that point is, okay, we failed in our top-down approach. We're not able to change the rules at the top, but what can we do to cut the legs out from the beast at the bottom? And that's where some of our on the ground community advocacy and direct legal services came into play, because community members started reporting to CAIR and Asian Law Caucus that, surprisingly, there are local police officers showing up with FBI agents at their door, at their home, at their work, who were following them around near the masjids. And we realized that, oh, okay, local police are working with the FBI to do these kinds of assessments. And then when we started digging into it more, doing more research around it, hearing from more community folks on it, and what we eventually realized is, oh, the FBI is using local police because they don't have enough people power. They don't literally have enough personnel to surveil us in the way that they are doing now and the way they were doing then without having local assistance. It's physically not possible. So we realized, okay, if you want to cut out a lot of the harm, what you could do is stop local police from working with the FBI. So once we realized there was a local hook and there was a local way that we could push back on this very federal abuse, we moved to cut off that local help. So not surprisingly, our initial strategy was to get the FBI, to get the local police department out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force altogether. Based on a lot of the abuses that we saw and for a number of other reasons. But this part of the story does get a little convoluted, and we're happy to share more details with folks who would like resources on that. But the effort to get the SFPD out of the JTTF altogether failed, at least failed at the time. And part of the reason, which we'll get into later, is that we had a really hard time explaining to people, convincing people that what was happening in our communities was real. This isn't imagined. This isn't something that we're making up for publicity, which, believe it or not, are some of the criticisms that we got here. These abuses are happening. It is hurting actual people, and it's severely impacting our communities. And given all of that, we realized, one, that we weren't going to be able at the time to get people, to get them out of the JTTF. But two, we also realized when we found out that at some point in time, San Francisco had secretly joined the Joint Terrorism Task Force, we realized even if we got them out of the JTTF altogether, even if that campaign had been successful, it would only be half a protection, because what we need is something on the books that would stop them from ever secretly rejoining it. Because otherwise you run into the risk that they will, you know, once we get agitated and we get mobilized and we pull them out of the JTTF, they'll just wait for something else to happen, wait for us to get distracted, and then secretly rejoin. So we want not only for them to stop being participating in these abuses, but we also want them to not be able to secretly rejoin without us knowing about it. So what we eventually ended up with is, and this is after years of back and forth on what this law looks like, but just to jump to the end of the story for a moment, the version of the law that we ended up with is a really simple 2-page document that is really easy to insert in any city's municipal code. And what it says is 3 main things. The first thing is telling the police department, look, you can only work with the FBI or the JTTF if and only if you follow every local and state rule that any other police department, that any other police officer in your department would have to follow. So what does that mean? No assessments. No assessments with you can't just go chase after Muslims just because they're Muslim. The second thing was in order to join the Joint Terrorism Task Force, the police sign a contract almost all of the time with the FBI, and that gives most of the power to the FBI agent, to the FBI in terms of supervision. So the second thing that the law says is, look, before you change that contract, before you sign another contract, before you so much as breathe on that contract, you have to let us know, and it has to be in a public forum so that we can get our communities mobilized and go and scream about how what you're doing is terrible, and hopefully stop you from doing it. And the third thing, which is also, which was pretty revolutionary, especially at the time, is requiring the local police department to put out an annual report talking about what exactly they're doing with it. Because at the end of the day, the police department is paid by our local tax dollars. So we have a right to know exactly what they're doing in these task forces. And the annual reporting requirement is a way for us to get that kind of information. And also, which is also a way that we use to push back on further participation in these kinds of task forces. So the San Francisco story, the reason why it says everything in the kitchen sink is because it literally took every strategy we could think of in order to get this law passed. It was the first city to do something like this, and there were a lot of San Francisco politics going on at the time, so that's the reason for this sort of like superhuman effort. But first we wanted to talk a little bit about a coalition that that was formed in order to push this law forward, and it's called the Coalition for a Safe San Francisco. And before we go into what exactly the Coalition for a Safe San Francisco is, we wanted to give a shout out to the hundreds of community members who repeatedly, consistently showed up for protests and vigils and actions and hearings and everything else that we asked of them. Because this law in San Francisco never would have passed without their involvement. That is crystal clear. So with that being said, we can talk a little bit more about the coalition itself. So the coalition involved 79, a huge number of organizations, 79 organizations, all of which were extremely diverse. Those organizations included, obviously, a large number of MEMSA groups, a lot of LGBTQIQ groups, churches, Jewish groups, interfaith groups, civil rights organizations, and also various community groups. So we had organizations that had only a few members on staff to organizations with hundreds of members on staff, and then in addition to that, also the hundreds of community members who were involved. So the Coalition for Safe San Francisco was extremely diverse, and that was a large part of its strength also. When talking about the Coalition for Safe San Francisco, we wanted to particularly give a shout out to the LGBTQIQ groups who were involved with this, because not only did they completely have the MEMSA communities back when this was being pushed forward at the most critical times, but they have remain committed to assisting in ensuring that compliance goes forward with this. So it's not just that they were there when we were fighting the fight, they're also there now when we are monitoring for compliance. And this is just a couple of the examples of the letters that were sent in on behalf of, from LGBTQ leaders in San Francisco, the Transgender Law Center. We're just extremely grateful for their support, so we wanted to highlight that, as well as the support of the Japanese American community, and particularly the family of civil rights hero Fred Korematsu. The image that you see there is his daughter Karen Korematsu, who showed up time and time and time again to testify on behalf of this ordinance and to show support to the MEMSA community. So going back to what part of the issue that we were having here, the problem was we knew that there was wide-scale abuse, but people weren't accepting our anecdotal evidence of that. Because of the nature of surveillance, it's really hard to get people to come out and say, hi, yes, I was surveilled by the FBI. It's for obvious reasons, it's really difficult for people to come forward and do that. And based on that and a number of other things, people just didn't believe us when we were talking about the harassment and abuse that was happening in our communities. And in particular, to put an actual name on it, people didn't believe that Obama's FBI could be responsible for these kinds of abuses. So one of the first things that we did is try to address that concern. And what we did was we worked with the city's Human Rights Commission, who was extremely helpful to work with, and we used the forums available to us at the Human Rights Commission to help impacted community members tell their stories. So in order to, you can't just have a hearing and expect people to show up. There was a massive amount of community outreach that happened in order to, and this was over months, to get people to attend, to get people to share their stories. There were a number of community meetings that happened all over the Bay Area. We came up with a variety of different tools to get the word out to people. So you see, like one example, a community member was brave enough not only to share his story, but also to allow us to use his image on these materials. And we used these, you see the back of the postcard there as well, and we distributed these postcards at Jummah events, which are Friday prayers. So we distributed that at Jummah prayers at every community event we could find. This and other material, we shared it widely online. And when we had people who were willing to, who were willing to actually testify, we had a legal team on staff to help screen them for vulnerabilities, to make sure we weren't just throwing community members up there without checking to make sure that it would be like at least somewhat safe for them to do that, and making sure that anybody who spoke was well aware of the risks that that were involved with speaking. Okay. So what we ended up doing is, so we had that hearing in 2010 where advocates, community members, and even folks from Portland came and testified about it. And the goal of that was to really document these stories of abuses so that we could have something to show to people when they gave us that tired line of, oh, this isn't really happening, and use this to really challenge these kinds of bias policies that continue to harm our communities. And so the Human Rights Commission held the hearing. A lot of people testified at it, and they finalized their findings in a report that was published in 2011. That was the link that we shared earlier on the Portland slide. So, so now going into the sort of the nitty-gritty of how this actually unfolded. In San Francisco, again, given San Francisco has some really interesting politics that are in play, and at almost every juncture of the legislative process, there were legal or political hurdles that we had to jump through. And at every single juncture, it was community involvement and community organizing that was key to getting us past those hurdles. So as you can see from the image of one of the flyers that we sent out to try and get people to show up to a board vote, we had organizers from CAIR, from Asian Law Caucus, from many, many, many other organizations. Because again, this was a 79 organization strong coalition that were fighting to push this law forward, and were also assisting community members in getting involved. And so you see more images of protests that we had, hearings that we had. This is the image on the left is City Hall, one of the hearing rooms at City Hall. You can see a bunch of people packed it. We used these colorful stickers to make it very visible to the people who were deciding these issues, and make it very visible to them that we were all there for the same purpose. And that enabled us to get very far along, almost to the finish line, actually. And then, when we were almost there, when we were almost done passing this law, there was a veto threatened. And our response to that veto was a mass prayer. We held a mass Jummah prayer right outside of City Hall that not only drew a lot of attention to this issue, but also made very explicit who we were directing it towards. As you can see from the close-up of the yellow sign there, it's very clear that this group of people were calling out the fact that we didn't want a veto to happen. And the fact that hundreds of people came out and prayed on the ground, that they were willing to come to a last-minute protest prayer, I think really shows how much community involvement was there. And the reason why we devoted 2 slides to this is we really wanted to show that the creative organizing behind this is really what helped us get over these hurdles. So, and also being mindful that Ahmad and I are attorneys, so we can't speak to, and we can't and shouldn't speak to how all the work that the organizers put into it. Although we are still obviously in close contact with them, so we can certainly connect people with those organizers if anybody would like more of a nitty-gritty of how all of these unfolded. So the protest prayer worked. And in addition to the protest prayer, we actually, we coupled it with something else. We cut down the law so that it was only 2 pages long. We took out all the whereas clauses. Usually for a law, they have a bunch of things in the beginning of it that don't actually count as a law, that say why the law was passed in the first place. We cut all of that out. We consolidated all the 3 protections into just 2 pages, and that, coupled with the intense community pressure that that was put on, enabled the law to finally pass. So what you see on the top right is the signing ceremony for the Safe San Francisco Civil Rights Ordinance, and just more images of all the work that was put into it. And what San Francisco really showed is that cities and counties have the power to decide if, when, and how their police officers participate in the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The FBI can't swoop in and demand that a city participate. If a city is in the Joint Terrorism Task Force, it means they have agreed to do it. And they shouldn't be allowed to shift the responsibility to the FBI, because those are local resources. They're controlled by local city councils. And it also demonstrated that we're not required to give up local oversight just in order to work with the FBI. And also for the advocates involved, the law obviously doesn't lock us into the Joint Terrorism Task Force, because after years of demonstrating compliance issues, including a really key client from CAIR SFBA, we were able to demonstrate that there were a number of compliance issues with it. Officers were not properly trained on what the new law requires. And because of these years of compliance issues, coupled with our allies sending in letters and continuing to express concern about compliance, and because of the community mobilization around every annual report, we were finally able to get SFPD to pull out of the JTTF on February 1st of last year. And that was a major moment for us. We still obviously have to be vigilant about it because they could go back in, but thankfully, because the law is in place, they can't secretly do it. Let's see. So, Ahmad, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Tina. So basically, I guess to recap all the excellent work that Tina, ALC, and CAIR have done is, what are the lessons that we learned from San Francisco, and how did that apply to, and in the later slides we'll talk about Oakland, but also our battles in the San Francisco Bay Area are not over. It can be a city by city, county by county effort, and even though people have the impression that the Bay Area is very liberal, there is still a lot of pushback from police departments who often tend to have sort of the tough on crime, open data network sharing throughout other federal law enforcement agencies. So like Tina said, the most important thing, number one, was community involvement. So that was grassroots organizing, not lawyers sort of leading the movement necessarily, but going on the ground, going to actual places where you had organizers, people who were actually affected themselves leading the campaign. Yes, our role was to basically explain some of these more fine legalistic mechanisms that law enforcement agencies use to sort of surveil our communities, and that was our work. There was a diverse group of allies and then one of the huge groups that were there outside of like your regular anti-surveillance groups was faith, multi-faith coalitions who were there, people from other communities who were impacted by surveillance, law enforcement agencies such as ICE, for example, and that was really helpful in doing that work. It goes without saying that no movement has gone forward without the creativity that we need. It's things like sending postcards, distributing them all across the city, speaking through like the Human Rights Commission in every city, using them as an avenue to like bring that up to city council. We had sort of reclaiming our public spaces through things like protest prayers that we will continue to do, whether that's occupying the space and making sure that those are heard. And that's something that I think for those of y'all who are organizers and people within the community have already been doing for many years, and that's something that will continue to be needed in things of that nature. We obviously had some legal and political hurdles where you would have various city council members sort of stalling on some of the bills, some of the portions of it, some of the key clauses that they wanted differently. You obviously have to anticipate that the police officers, unions, and the associations will step in and try to like dumb down, for lack of a better word, to cut it down where it's the law and the local ordinance effectively lacks the teeth to do anything. But obviously using sort of the strategy of involving people who are sort of experienced with political strategizing is helpful. The one thing that is obviously to be expected is the discomfort and fear of going against local law enforcement agencies as well as the FBI. As a lot of our clients are members of impacted communities directly, it's very reasonable because a lot of them have a lot at stake that others of us who are more privileged do not. And so that's obviously one thing that you want to keep in mind, and we're going to have to go through it. But obviously, what we learned was when we did the work that was necessary on the ground, that community members were often on board with some of the work that we did. So again, like I mentioned earlier, there will be strategies in terms of how do you do the legal organizing and versus the actual grassroots efforts that are needed. We sort of have, and Tina more so than I has a lot of experience with like navigating that field, what sort of our templates are, our recommendations are, and we also have organizers in the field who did that great work that we can connect you to. Before I move on to Oakland, I want to belabor this point a little bit that every city is really different. People might think, again, like I said, the Bay Area being considered a solidly liberal area, that you would not have some of these same issues, but every city is really different in terms of its dynamics within the communities, but also within local council. So, SF took us years and years of work, and then you'll see in the Oakland example, it worked out a little differently. So to focus on Oakland, why was Oakland different? Even though it's just across the bridge from San Francisco, has some of the same liberal dynamics. We also know from, the history of Black Power movements and other civil rights organizations in Oakland that the community there has already been very, very, intimately involved and aware of the abuses of law enforcement, including the FBI. And at the time that we launched this campaign, number 45 was already in power, so it was not very hard to get people on board, as opposed to like the pre-Trump years where the Obama administration put on a more polished lacquer onto some of the same surveillance strategies that they had. And so it was much more easier for us to like push this and see why this is important. We again involved the city's Privacy Advisory Commission, which if your city has something along those lines is very effective, and that's one way you want to target. They helped push our ordinance forward, a similar ordinance. Like we took some of the meat and the bones from the Safe San Francisco ordinance and moved it on to Oakland. And that's also somewhere that I think we'll talk about is where we can assist with. We have sort of a template of what's worked, what provides the right accountability, and then obviously there's a little bit of fine tuning with what works in your city. And so within months, we were able to pass the ordinance, which is called the McElhaney Ordinance. It's named after a council member in Oakland, but it does effectively the same things that the ordinance in San Francisco does. Also, the downside of it is that the community members themselves are less open to coming forward and speaking about this issue, obviously, because of the fact that the organizing work did not have to be as expansive as early. We already had grassroots organizations that were tied into it, and so we sort of got into that work involved. Again, to belabor that point again, the Privacy Advisory Commission was already focused on things like police surveillance oversight with equipments like tasers and body cams. But also this is around the time that a lot of the focus is, especially in cities like Oakland and San Francisco, on cutting ties with ICE in terms of, with how ICE can come into like local holding facilities and take individuals who may be undocumented. And, the other important thing that we found out during our research was that JTTF agents usually collect something called USPer info. So what does USPer mean? It means US persons. So, these are individuals who may be a US citizen or a green card holder or an LPR, as a legal permanent resident in sort of legalese. And so even in sanctuary cities or so-called sanctuary cities like Oakland and San Francisco, we have local cops who are collecting that immigration information, even though they're not supposed to under that law. And so we found that some of that work was really important. I'm gonna actually ask Tina to jump in and sort of speak to her experience in working on sort of these assessments.
Sure thing. So as Ahmad was describing, the campaign in Oakland was very different. And one of the reasons why it was different is because while we were just in the beginning stages of Oakland, we found out that we saw this document. This is called the Baseline Collection Plan. And it's basically, it is a document that is sent to every Joint Terrorism Task Force across the country. And it explains to them the kind of information that they should routinely collect during their assessments. And just to refresh everyone's memory, assessments are what is the boot on the neck of the MEMSA community, essentially. When it comes to FBI surveillance, it's almost always in the context of an assessment. So during these assessments, they are told to the extent possible, as a matter of routine, to collect a lot of information. And the image to the right that you see on your screen is an excerpt from that page, and the number 3 thing that you see there is U.S. person status. So if they're collecting information about whether or not someone is a U.S. citizen or a U.S. legal permanent resident, that means that notation also lets you know if that person is not, which means someone who's a lot more vulnerable, a visa holder, someone who's undocumented. So the fact is, there's an ICE, ICE is embedded in every JTTF. JTTF involves our local officers. Local officers and the FBI are the ones who are surveilling and harassing our community. And all of those officers in the JTTF are supposed to be collecting immigration information on people. And mind you, this shouldn't be a distinction. It shouldn't matter whether or not someone has allegedly committed a crime or not, but they are actively going after people who have not done anything. They may even know that the person has not done anything wrong, and yet they are still collecting this very invasive information from people. And when they collect someone's US person status, their immigration status, they don't just put it in a manila envelope and file it away in a drawer. It gets put into a database that gets shared across the federal government and across state governments. And as Ahmad said earlier on, that is one of the ways in which information is shared between the FBI and Customs and Border Protection, or TSA, at the airport. So that's how we see things like FBI questions being asked at the border when people don't have access to an attorney, and an attorney can't physically go into that space because we're blocked. So this was an extremely troubling revelation, and it's particularly important, we think, for sanctuary cities to know that, and this information is still not that widely known, but we think it's particularly important for every sanctuary city to know about this, because if you have a sanctuary city policy on the books that you think is preventing local police from collecting immigration information and sharing it with the federal government, if you have a JTTF in your city, that may not be the case, because what we have seen time and time again is that JTTF agents routinely violate local and state law. That's the whole crux of the issue here. So even if you have a sanctuary city law on the books, they've ignored or violated every other local law on the books. So why would we think that they're not violating this also? And many city councils or board of supervisors don't know to ask this question. They don't know about the existence of this issue. So even if you are completely uninterested in doing anything on the JTTF, if you are working around ICE issues, we strongly encourage you to look into this. We're more than happy to provide more resources on it, but ICE is insidious, and it's embedding itself into a number of different entities that you may not necessarily think of when you think of how to resist ICE abuses. So that's the reason why we wanted to hit on this point quite a bit. So just to sort of wrap up, and Ahmad, please feel free to jump in. At the end of the day, what we wanted to share is that if you are interested in doing a campaign like this, there are a lot of creative ways to do it. You don't have to have it be attorney-led, because we have a toolkit, we have the model law itself, which doesn't need to be tinkered with. We have everything available for people to just pick up and run with. So it's not something that needs to be tied into any other effort. And it certainly doesn't need to be led by attorneys, although there are attorneys at Asian Law Caucus, CAIR, and a number of other organizations who would be more than willing to talk through any legal strategizing issues that are there. What we will say, though, is that because this is not an IMEMSA issue, but because the IMEMSA community is so impacted by this, by these kinds of abuses, we think it's really important that you have an IMEMSA org that does a lot of work with the community involved in these kinds of efforts. So whether it was San Francisco or Oakland, we, CAIR and Asian Law Caucus have really close connections with the masjids that are in these spaces. And we were able to use, we know the leaders, we were able to share this information so people know what we were doing and why. And that was also a way for people to, if they feel comfortable, to come forward and talk about abuses. Again, in San Francisco, it was really critical for that to happen. And so a lot more work went into getting people into those public spaces to be able to speak about their experiences. In Oakland, that wasn't as necessary, and people had an extra reason to be frightened. And so that's why the Oakland experience didn't have nearly as much community testimony or visible community involvement. And we always have to be mindful that no matter what is good for the community, no matter what is best for the community, we also have to start with what is best for the person involved, because we're not the ones who are putting ourselves on the line. It's the people who are testifying as to these abuses who are doing that. So we always want to be mindful of that. So even if it's beneficial for the larger group, that doesn't mean that the onus is on the individual to put themselves in the crosshairs even more than they already are. And also, we're, the one good thing I think about 45 is that cross-community coalitions and cross-movement coalitions have become a lot stronger. There are entities like Freedom Cities where we're working on so many different issues, yet we have a forum to get together and talk about these issues. There are a number of additional resources that are available to us now that were not available to San Francisco. And because of that, and because of the unique politics of San Francisco, that went a certain way. But I think the lesson learned here is, it's good to know the story of what happened to get ideas, and it's good to pull out specific pieces that are helpful, but there's by no means a need to replicate the San Francisco model elsewhere. And I think the Oakland model really shows that. So Ahmad, is there anything you would like to add?
No, I think you've got most of it covered, Tina. But like I said, I think our contact information is out there, and we're happy to respond and jump on a call